And I think what you're hitting on, Bilal, is actually like the framework for how you should think about big opportunities in India, right? So this is the thing I'd actually say most Western investors, just miss completely, right? So if we take a step back, in the early days, right, most startups, and I think I mentioned this, were built for India 1A and India 1, right? So the archetype of these companies was X for Y startups. You take a model from the US, right, you adapt it to India. So basically what we just talked about with Ola and Uber. These archetypes of startups obviously can capture a lot of value. They're proven, right, business models. There's a proven need. They just have to be adapted for a new environment. But this breaks when you're building for a country where there's so much room for growth in terms of market structure, right? Especially when you're at a technology inflection point like India is. And when that happens, you really have to take a look at the market structure from a first principles perspective. So X for Y startups at best won't capture nearly as much value as if they were natively built for the market, right? And at worst, right, on the other side, they just won't work, right?
All right, welcome to another episode of Not Investment Advice. We've got Trung and Bilal here. Unfortunately, Jack couldn't make it today, but we have a very special guest. Romeen, welcome to the show, man.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate it. And I think this is the All Asia episode. I think we coordinated Jack not being here today.
That's it. We're talking Bollywood films, cricket only today. Well, in fact, I got my special T-shirt on today. I don't know if you guys can see that there, but it's the Sholay tee. It's normally Jack Butcher with the merch, but I had to bring it out today, man.
I gotta say this, Bilal. So we've talked about this on the show previously. So obviously in England, the UK, where you and Jack are from, Asia refers to South Asia. Where I'm from, Pacific West Coast, Pacific Northwest. When you say Asia, you're thinking Chinese, Hong Kong, Taiwanese, Southeast Asia.
Yeah,
so
of course.
I'm asking Romeen, when you hear Asia, what clicks in your ear? Is it the East Asia or South Asia?
I definitely don't think of you. When I think of Asia, I think of Bilal, myself.
Okay.
I think
That's
China,
the correct answer. There we go.
We have to caveat with an extra place for Vietnam for you.
Yeah, the South.
That's true. Vietnam's its own thing.
No one
Southeast
thinks
Asia.
Southeast Asia when they're saying Asia, right? Oh yeah, man, this guy looks Cambodian. No one thinks that. Actually, Indonesians and Malays and they probably guess a lot because they're a little bit darker, closer to the equator. But Vietnamese are not. No one's thinking about, this guy looks like it's like they're thinking East Asia, right? They're thinking.
Well, but it's interesting though, Trung, because in the US, if you say Asia, you do normally think of, like
East
you said,
Asia.
Chinese. Well, Chinese, Japanese,
How strong
etc.
relationship with Japan and China?
I'd say in the U.S., when you think of Asia, you don't even think of Indian, right? Like you
I
call
agree.
out
Yeah.
Indian,
Oh, yeah.
separately,
True.
right? And then
You just call me Arab, even though I'm not. You know what I mean? That's what people call me.
That's
That
what
is-
happens.
that
They
is
call me some
possible.
other things too, but it depends what time of the day it is. But I was going to say, contrastingly, in the UK, if you say Asian, like in the press,
Yeah.
we are the brown people of Asia are the Asians there because we have a Indian, British Prime Minister.
Rishi?
We have a
Yeah.
Pakistani, British Mayor of London. 1 in 5 people in London look like me as well. So that's kind of the difference. But listen, man, we didn't even intro you properly. So Romeen, tell us a little bit about your background because we all know each other from Twitter. You guys have hung out in person recently. But
Yeah.
I'm taking this from your Twitter bio. It said bootstrap to business to 60 mil. Congrats on that. Bought in PE and currently in the next leg of the journey. Angel invested in 75 companies. And this was the kicker, trying to make my parents proud. That was my favorite line because that is Asian mindset, bro. That is always what we're trying to do. So what else do we miss out there?
It's a very Asian mindset. That captures it in a nutshell. So grew up in the States from immigrant parents, immigrant family. So first generation for us. But they came here with a very similar immigrant story that a lot of other folks have, right? Came to this country with absolutely nothing. And in fact, it was a little bit wilder of a story. So my dad grew up in East Africa, in Uganda, and actually lived a good middle-class lifestyle. His parents were working class folks, and got kicked out of the country by Idi Amin, the brutal African dictator. Idi Amin specifically actually kicked out all the Indians out of East Africa. And so most folks, and Bilal, you'll know this, most of these folks actually went to the UK, right, as refugees.
Yeah.
Are
you Gujarati by any chance?
I am. Yeah.
Yeah,
I am.
a lot of Gujarati
Wait,
friends
hold
who
on.
came
What was
from
it?
that
Let's
part.
frame this number. I believe the number is, and correct me if I'm wrong, when Idi Amin kicked the Indians out of Uganda, there's 100,000 Gujaratis responsible for over 50% of the country's GDP. Is this
Yeah.
correct? Like ballpark?
That's exactly right.
Okay.
Well, people that are listening, if you really abstract it out, if you know anything about kind of the Patel hotel mafia, Patels are Gujaratis, right?
Yeah.
And so Gujaratis kind of have this street rap in India that's the clan of Indians that are really top notch at business, right? That's kind of like the street cred, right? So anyway, so my grandfather was a freedom fighter in India. He had been jailed, and they left India to go to Africa, and he was working at ExxonMobil's predecessor. It was a company called Esso Oil, and working class, blue collar worker there. And it just so happened that there was a merit scholarship that was made available for all the executives' children, right? You still had to compete for it, but it was basically, available for the executives' children. My grandfather kind of fought his way in, made a ton of noise, and basically his belief was, look, if my kid, has a shot at this too, then my kid can compete with the best of them, right? My kid just needs a shot. And so he fought his way in, and so my dad was able to compete for that scholarship. A fun fact is he was one of the first people in Africa to actually take the SAT, right? So this was a totally wild and different time. And so what overlapped and kind of coincided with that period of time was, he had just received a scholarship to come to the States, and Idi Amin had kicked everybody out of the country. And so the entire family flew to the UK as refugees. He came over to the US, at 15. And this is the 70s, right? There's no cell phones. There's no family. There's no Indian restaurants. There's nothing, right? It's a completely kind of barren land. And so when I say kind of, trying to make my parents proud, he's the reason, right? And our family is the reason this immigrant kind of mentality and immigrant story is the reason that we have, in comparison, such an easy life. Right. And so I always try to just keep that as perspective whenever, anything is difficult in business or life or whatever it might be, that, it's a hell of a lot harder. It's a hell of a lot easier rather than showing up, at 15 with no money in your pockets, not knowing anybody and being 10,000 miles away from anybody you've ever met. So we grew up here. We grew up in a really comfortable, a comfortable life. My parents, fully lived the American dream. And they've been super supportive. And so my story personally is, I grew up in the States, as I mentioned, in Atlanta. I spent about 10 years outside, for undergrad, law school. I went to Duke, I went to Harvard. And then, I never practiced as a lawyer. And so that's probably another story for another day. But joined startups, got really interested in business and joined startups. And this last business been working on, Bilal, to your point, we bootstrapped it to pretty decent scale. And sold a chunk of it to private equity last year and brought them in as partners. And then in
what
parallel,
is that business? Don't bury the lead. What is that business?
It's a workforce management business. So there's a lot of online chatter, kind of, these boring businesses, right? That end up actually being pretty good businesses. And I think actually most businesses, quite candidly, we get this rap and tack of like everything is sexy and exciting. Most businesses, if you think of them in the world, are just they're kind of boring, right? Like they're solving a need that somebody has in the world, whether it's a consumer or an enterprise. And so we help companies basically with all their workforce management issues, right? So whether it's actually staffing and recruiting and finding people, whether it's managing those people, and then for large enterprises, actually putting whole, programs around those people. So it turns out that large companies, they don't spend, $5 million a year, $10 million a year on workers. They spend, $500 million a year, $1 billion a year on workers and workforces, right? So run that business, and then in parallel, do a ton of angel investing, as Bilal mentioned as well, right? And the angel investing is a combination of, classic tech startup investing, and it's also incubating, different types of cash flow businesses, right? And so it's a lot of fun actually to run, a kind of cash flow services business, and also have, kind of knee-deep tentacles in technology and software businesses, because there's a lot to learn, from both sides. So it's become kind of a portfolio approach, right, of different types of businesses, and that's primarily what I do.
Love it, man. Yeah, are you still working? You and Sean working on the fund together? Is that still the case?
We are. Yeah, we
Sean
are.
VP on Twitter. Sean Puri. People know him probably from My First Million pod.
Yeah. So we went to Duke together. We've known each other for a really long time, and we partnered up together, I think about 3-4 years ago now at this stage, to create a little vehicle and invest in a bunch of companies.
Amazing.
So we've invested in, probably close to 100 companies now. And it's across sectors, across stages, primarily in the US, although we do, I would say we're like probably like 15% of what we've done has actually been in India, right? We're both from India originally.
You teed yourself up.
I like that transition.
Yeah,
there you go.
yeah,
India.
you see that?
You're looking at my notes right here. What's going on?
This was the raison d'etre of this podcast. For those that are not familiar, Romeen is quite vocal online about the India tech scene. He did I believe a 10 or 12 podcast episode series with the Joint Colossus podcast network about India, Return on India. And that's what we're here to cook on. So Bilal, you had lots of questions. I kind of want you to tee up Romeen.
Yeah, so I guess we can start off by talking a little bit about what people misunderstand about India. I think from my point of view, speaking to people about that region and generally Asia, people just, if they haven't spent time there, they haven't invested in that part of the world, they don't fully know the scale of change that's happened. And the perception really comes from like a few movies they've seen or a few random articles they've read. So I'll push it over to you. Like, what is the common misunderstandings and things that kind of surprise people when we talk about India as a market and as a country?
Yeah, well, you nailed it on the head, right? Like, so if you think of kind of Western, demographics, Western exposure, and you think over the last kind of 20, 30 years, what do you think of when you think of India, right?
Slumdog Millionaire comes to mind for a lot of people.
You think of Slumdog Millionaire, you think of Apu from The Simpsons, you think of, outsource, you think of IT tech support, right? And look, there's some truth to that, right? I mean, the first generation of really great Indian companies, right, Indian tech companies, were these large outsourced IT services businesses, right? So the Infosys, the Cognizants, et cetera, of the world. And what they realized was it turns out that the cost structure, in India is wildly different than America. The skill set is not wildly different though. And so from a business perspective, you can make a really good business out of saying, hey, we've got a country of 1 billion people. It turns out they can do the same things that you guys do over there, but we pay them, a third of the cost or a fourth of the cost, right? And so this whole trope of kind of IT tech support and the Indian accent, et cetera, is because there were millions and millions of Indian IT tech workers. It also became a very common way to come to America, right? You'd come on an H-1B visa, or you would basically be, you get relocated from your company because you were doing, an IT job. It was a monolith of kind of what is India, right? Which is ironic and interesting for a country of, 1.5 billion people, right? To think of it as kind of a monolith of one archetype of people. But what's changed over the last, say 15 years or so, I'd say two big things have changed. So one is obviously Western exposure to India has gotten significantly different, right? I mean, it's, folks like us that live, here in the States, have grown up in the States, et cetera. We don't have accents, we assimilate into the culture, right? And so there's the very natural kind of, exposure in that way. In the Indian startup ecosystem, I think this is probably more important though, the last 10 years have been this kind of catalyst of for growth, right? There's been more change, I'd say, in the last 10 to 15 years than there's been, in the prior 100 odd years or so. It may seem like a little bit of an exaggeration, but here's why, right? So over the last 5 years, I'd say there's really been, over the last 10-ish years, I'd say there's really 5 things that have really kind of spurred this catalyst. So the first is demographics, right? So India has a lot of people, like we just talked about, but what is often not known about India is India has over 500 million people under 25. So when you think of China and you think of kind of a demographic age bomb that they're going through, right? They might have the same number of people, but they're going through a huge demographic age bomb with the one-child policy. India has 500 million people under the age of 25. So a massively youthful economy. Of those 500 million people, over 125 million of them speak English. So what most people don't realize and most people don't know is they think that Hindi, right, is the national language of India. It's not. English is the national language of India, right? So you have this extremely young, demographic, and they all speak English, number one. Number two is, we can double click into this a little bit, but Reliance Jio did something really interesting, 6-7 years ago as well with the Reliance Jio. Basically what they did was the cost of internet and internet accessibility, the cost of internet was very high and internet accessibility was really low, right? And what they did was they said, you know what we're going to do is we're going to absolutely slash the price of the internet. And what that's going to enable and allow, it's going to allow for a massive surge of online users. So there's over 830 million people in India that use the internet today. This is up almost, 100% over the last couple of years. There's 860 million smartphone users, which is similarly up, over 100% in the last 4 or 5 years. And then the most interesting one is there's over, the amount of data consumption that takes place on a monthly basis has 100x in the last decade, right? So you have this young population that speaks English. You brought all of them online, right? And then from an economic perspective, you have two things going on. One is you have a significant amount, you have increased purchasing power that's happening in that base of young people, right? So, over 500 million people, right? The predictions are over 500 million people by 2025 are going to be in the middle class in India. Now, those numbers are different, but it means that there's real consumption power and real purchasing power. And then foreign direct investment has shot into the country, right? So one of the latest news stories people are probably familiar with is Apple. You see this kind of image shot of Tim Cook walking in India, and the headline is Apple is opening up, really big manufacturing facilities for the iPhone to diversify themselves away from China, right? And so the amount of foreign direct investment that's come into the country, has been significant as well. So when you tie all these things up in terms of you have young people, they speak English, they're more assimilated, I'd say, with US and Western culture than China is, for example. You have this massive surge of people that are coming online. Other countries are taking notice and pumping money into the economy. People inside in the economy themselves are bringing themselves up, out of poverty and out of, the lower tiers of economic power. It sets off this catalyst effect. Now, tech valuations, et cetera, have obviously reset. But you had, 50 unicorns in 2021, right? Hit, for example, right? Questionable how many of those are still unicorns, but it speaks to the broader thesis and broader idea, which is, people are really excited about India, right? The markets are large, the talent is great, and the velocity of movement and companies being built is significant. So it's a really exciting time. It's really this change though has come into effect over the last decade, right?
Yeah,
and
for
this
sure.
is why the #1 YouTube channel is T-Series, right?
It is.
Oh yeah.
Well, you probably remember so Bilal used to work at YouTube. You probably saw that Indian usage going up and up and up. What was
mad,
that YouTube talk like about around India?
No, I think it was similar because it was through that stage where I think you said 800 million smartphone users, right? And that was happened mainly in the last 10 years. So a lot of those are probably Android, I'm assuming, as well, even though iPhone probably a decent chunk of it there. So yeah, I think it was always a big, I didn't realize it was the biggest one until more recently. I don't know if that's still the case or if it's changed, but I remember just seeing, like, for example, one of my friends from the UK is a musician. His name's Zach Knight. And I met him just as he's starting his music career, and he's like, I'm singer-songwriter. And I'm like, yo, that's cool you're doing that, but like your parents are definitely not happy about this one because he wanted him to be a doctor, standard. And then I look back a year later, this guy hit #1 song in India, and I go to T-Series. It's hosted on T-Series. It's like over 1 billion views for this one song, and maybe more than that. Like it's crazy. The scale of it is crazy.
You're sleeping on him, Bilal. You were sleeping on your boy.
I know. I always believed in him. Always believed, but it's pretty incredible. But it's actually a really interesting point, Romeen, because he's a British Pakistani guy actually, and the girl he made the song with was an Indian British girl, Jasmine Walia. And it is interesting that you said about the cultural difference. So one of the things in your tweet thread, you said India's 30 countries in one. I'd love to go into that a little bit more, because that combined with the fact you said about the knowledge of the international culture of, like, in your thread, you talked about they watch Friends, Seinfeld, like all these shows we grew up watching as well. That has been exported a lot there, and they love American Western culture. So I'm curious to understand a little bit more about, like, things people might not know, even beyond the business side. Just, you mentioned the language, for example. Like, I don't know how many languages there are, but there's probably like hundreds of dialects and stuff, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the interesting thing, again, kind of it goes back to the India as a monolith concept, right? So, India has 1.4 billion people, right? And it has, these, let's say these, round numbers, 30 states, right? Each of these individual locations, there was an interesting map actually that was going on around Twitter. I'll find it and send it to you guys, which was,
I saw that. Ian Bremmer posted it, right?
if you take a percentage of the world's population and you thought of every individual Indian state, right? So you literally have Indian states that on their own, would be 1% of the world's population, right? And so when you think about it like that, right, you say, well, wait a minute, it turns out that there are different cultures, there are different, there are different festivities, there are different religions, there are different language, there's different customs, etc. commonality is really that they're just geographically tied together, right? But other than that, there's significant change and there's significant differences, right? In those locations themselves. India, the more interesting way to think about India, rather than even just the 30 individual states, which by the way, I think is why actually a lot of Indian founders don't get as overwhelmed by this concept of international expansion. So a very common trope or a very common question is, hey, how do you expand internationally, et cetera? And a bunch of founders had told me, either when I was investing in them or talking with them, they said, look, just to expand in India itself, it's like we're going into 50 countries, right? And so this idea of kind of when we go outside from India and into somewhere else, we're not nearly as, concerned, bothered, overwhelmed by it. Because when we expand into a different state, we have to go into a different language, we have to go around different festivals, we have to go around different customs. We can't offend this person, we can't offend that person, we have to think about this dynamic, et cetera, right? And those nuances are actually very, very deep and very, very different, right, comparatively than abroad. The way I think about India, which I think is probably the more constructive way to think about India, is there's actually 4 Indias in one, okay? So it's India 1A, India 1, India 2, India 3. So India 1A is a very, very small set of people. It's about 25 million people. And these are the people that you were just mentioning, right? This is really what most people think of when you think of consumer India. So highly advanced, highly adept to Western culture and products, native English speakers, right? Good purchasing power, et cetera. India 1 is a broader group. It's like 25 to, let's say, 100 million with the per capita income of, about $10,000 per year, right? And so most companies that kind of most startups that build for India, they build for India 1A and India 1. That's where all the purchasing power in the country is. India 2 is the next 100 million people. This is like the most exciting cohort of 100 million people. They're digitally affluent, right? They're online. They're part of those stats that I mentioned earlier. They're starting to come into some purchasing power, but they're not quite there in terms of actually being able to purchase in a way that's meaningful, kind of for, let's say, Western startups, Western companies. And then you have India 3, which is basically the entire country, right? It's like 1.2 billion people, right? And these are the people that, they don't have the purchasing power yet. They're just starting to come online, right? This is kind of what you think of when you think of poor India. Now, the flip side of that, and this is what, what's really interesting, is just imagine as that 1.2 billion gets brought up, right? India 1A, India 1, India 2, et cetera, right? Then the possibilities are significant. In fact, when you start thinking of what types of companies should be built, or what would do really well in India, it's also why you kind of see this trajectory of the initial cohort of companies that did really well in India were these kind of like X for Y companies, right? Like you have Ola in India, which is like the Uber for India. Makes a ton of sense because India 1A is only 25 million people, right? They're basically modulating and emulating their life around, the West. Bilal, you made a comment, right, of one thing that I said in the thread, which is, hey, these people grew up, watching Friends or Seinfeld or so on and so forth. That is the big culture shock, right, for people when they go back to India is India youth from India 1A. I mean, you literally, especially in a Zoom world, you could not tell that this person is in India versus, in California, right?
Like, if you just watch Oppenheimer, they got thoughts about Cillian Murphy and Nolan's directing.
Absolutely, right? And like, forget the accent part, et cetera. Like, there is, for a lot of these people, there is no accent, right? They grew up in English medium schools, et cetera. You talk about Western culture, Western movies, et cetera. You
sound more English than me at times.
Yeah, you would not know the difference.
Yeah.
You would not know the difference at all, right? Which is super powerful. It also speaks to another, kind of reason why I think India will assimilate a lot better than, like, let's say China or so. But you just cannot tell the difference, right? So I think when you think about India, like the right way to think about it is really think about it as these 4 Indias, right? That's really the way you should think about the consumer economy. Somebody had put it really well to me was when you actually segment these these archetypes, you can actually start thinking of parallels like, India 1A or India 1 is kind of like a Mexico, right? And then, the next segment is like the Philippines, right? So you can kind of start thinking about analogous countries in the world to actually map to India. But it's incredibly diverse, it's incredibly large, incredibly, heterogeneous, and that's what makes it really exciting.
You know that you mentioned the under 25 population being 500 million.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, out of those 1A, 1, 2, and maybe I missed one, but the 4 groups of people.
Sure.
I'm assuming majority of those are in the last bucket just because of the size of the bucket, but are a lot of those people in the other ones too?
Yeah, a lot of them are in India 3 for sure. I don't have the numbers quite off the top of my head, but what I do know and what I experienced both from going to India as well as kind of doing that, podcast series was the folks that are in India 1A, right? Though, I mean, those consumers can really spend, right? So if India 1 is kind of 10K per year, I don't know what the per capita is for India 1A, but these are the people that, especially the top runs of that India 1A, they're purchasing just like a normal, American pricey consumer, right? Which is actually what is, flowing a lot of, funds through the economy, right? Is you actually have a consumer class, that can really spend.
And so you mentioned kind of like that massive change in the last 10 years. So when, we have to mention once a week, I worked at Google. He already talked about YouTube, but one of the things at Google that was a kind of focus for us was the next billion users, right? Like the next billion coming from India and a lot of Asia and Africa. And what we found was, like you said there, like some companies and startups are going and saying, all right, we're just going to make the Uber, the Airbnb, the whatever for this region. And there are some successful use cases. But what we actually found, the most interesting examples is where they skipped that middle part and created something native for that region. And this isn't just in India, it's in a lot of Africa as well. And so I'm curious if you've got any examples of what that looks like in a mobile first native kind of mode in India of companies that are coming out of there.
Yeah, so there's a ton of examples. I'll give one specifically. And I think what you're hitting on, Bilal, is actually like the framework for how you should think about big opportunities in India, right? So this is the thing I'd actually say most Western investors, just miss completely, right? So if we take a step back, in the early days, right, most startups, and I think I mentioned this, were built for India 1A and India 1, right? So the archetype of these companies was X for Y startups. You take a model from the US, right, you adapt it to India. So basically what we just talked about with Ola and Uber. These archetypes of startups obviously can capture a lot of value. They're proven, right, business models. There's a proven need. They just have to be adapted for a new environment. But this breaks when you're building for a country where there's so much room for growth in terms of market structure, right? Especially when you're at a technology inflection point like India is. And when that happens, you really have to take a look at the market structure from a first principles perspective. So X for Y startups at best won't capture nearly as much value as if they were natively built for the market, right? And at worst, right, on the other side, they just won't work, right? So a really good example of this is a company I invested in. It's a company called ShipRocket. These guys are doing hundreds of millions of US dollars of ARR, right? So absolutely, a flyaway kind of success in the Indian tech landscape. The first idea these guys wanted to build was they wanted to build Shopify for India, right? So their idea was very simple, right? You look in the rest of the world, this whole e-commerce thing is taking off. So why can't we do e-commerce in India, right? And if you follow all the top level things we just talked about, you get really excited about e-commerce in India. You'd say there's these billions of users, they're all coming online, et cetera. So they toiled around with it, for years and were banging their heads on the wall. And they actually, the company name, I believe the company name initially was actually CartRocket, right? So the idea was really, we're going to build a Shopify, for India. Turns out that what they realized was it doesn't matter if you build a Shopify for India and you bring people online to purchase, because there's no economical way to actually get the products to them, right? So Shopify for India just doesn't work because I can get Trung and Bilal and Romeen and everybody can say, hey, I want that, Bollywood jacket that Shah Rukh Khan wore in this, latest film. But there's literally no way to get that jacket to them.
You're talking about roads and like infrastructure and logistics.
There's
no
like a logistics issue. Yeah,
there's a massive logistics issue. So what they built instead was they built a courier aggregation business, right? So their idea was, well, what it turns out for most of these really small mom and pops is shipping is not economical for them. They have to charge an arm and a leg. And so the consumer can't pay that arm and leg, right? And so they just don't buy. So the consumer might come online, but they're just not actually going to buy. So what they said is this, look, let's take, certainly some of the main kind of shipping players. There's no, USPS corollary, FedEx corollary, et cetera, but at least some of the main, larger players. And then let's pair that with an entire local delivery system. So one of the funny things, Bilal, you'll know this, when you go to India or so, for example, right, or Pakistan, it's all the same. If you go, you ask somebody for directions on the street, they're not going to tell you that, take a left at, Dalmore Drive and, Woodbury Lane, et cetera. They're going to say, go straight. You're going to see this guy standing on the road with a cart of milk. Take a right there. Then go down a little bit further and you're going to see this like, you know, kind of like half farm, et cetera. Take a right there, right?
That's points of interest. Yeah.
Points of interest, right? It's not street signs and kind of infrastructure, et cetera. Now, you know, Google Maps, et cetera, has gotten significantly better, but and kind of brought some of that infrastructure to the country, which helps, right? And mobile helps in that too. But a lot of this is still kind of last mile is still very, very challenging in countries like this. It's very, very different, right? So what these guys said is they said, look, let's build a courier aggregation business where we can basically end to end, you know, from larger shipping to more regional shipping to kind of all the way to last mile. You know, we've built out this system where any e-commerce company can plug into it. And because of that massive amount of scale, they can get economic prices. So they can run their businesses, consumers don't have to pay an arm and a leg. And it turns out that if we build the railroads, right, or the rails, right, then we're actually going to power e-commerce infrastructure in the country, right? Because otherwise there's just no way to do it, right? And so, you know, that business has become a massive business. It will go public in India one day. It will continue to be a really well-run, you know, a big business as long as it's well-run, but there's no analog for that in Western markets. So imagine coming to, you know, Silicon Valley and pitching that, hey, we are going to build, you know, this courier aggregation business. And, you know, a bunch of Harvard and Stanford VCs are like, yeah, that's great. But why don't you build Shopify for India? Right?
Yeah.
And so this is the disconnect, right? The disconnect is like you hear that kind of idea and it doesn't even compute. Like the first 5 times I heard that idea and I spent a bunch of time with Sahil, the founder, I just like didn't understand. Because in my head, I was like, well, why doesn't USPS just do this? Right? Like, well, it turns out there is no USPS, right? And so and then you have to unpack all the layers of like why it's not just like obvious to say you can go build a USPS for India. To build a USPS for India, it's a completely different, you know, thing that you have to build. So, you know, when you take a step back and you just think about how many foundational pieces are really yet to be built, right? So for example, the number of unbanked people in the country, right, that aren't appropriately served, or the fact that credit markets are super nascent, right? So there's 1.4 billion people in the country. Trung, how many credit cards do you think exist in the country?
This is from your thread. It's under 10%. Is this right? Less.
So you're at around 10%. Below, how many do you think?
I can't remember from the thread either, but yeah, I think it's probably around less than 10% because of trust. I think of the trust issue. They might not trust credit cards. They might, and so yeah,
2%.
2%. 30 million.
What's the number in the United States?
30 million credit cards. Oh, in the US, I'm not sure, but it's
50 to it's probably 50, 60, 70%, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right.
There's no credit. This was mind blowing. I have to say it. There's almost like no functioning credit system in India, or there is, but it's for the very small sliver at the top.
Very, very small.
Mind blowing.
There's 30 million credit cards in a country of 1.5 billion people. And just think about fundamentally the effect of credit, right? I mean, why do you use credit? Credit is correlated with growth of an economy. You literally cannot grow an economy without credit, right? Otherwise you're matching up all your pay cycles.
It's a time machine. It's the whole point. You're
bringing the world forward literally through the use of credit, right?
Yeah.
So there's a lot of really interesting ideas to be built. The right way to think about what are the biggest ideas going to be is it's not going to be the Uber for India, the Airbnb for India. There's another idea, which is, or another example of this, which is really interesting, which is a company called Mama Earth in India. And Mama Earth has turned into one of the fastest, D2C companies in India. I think they had like 100 million in revenue in like 3 or 4 years or so. And started out mostly as insect repellent, right? Just doesn't make sense in the rest of the world, right? Like these types of brands, like how big is the market? How quickly would they, emerge, et cetera? And then all the skincare products and the beauty products that they created were not emulations of what else is there in the world, right? They were skincare products for, Indians with darker skin, lighter skin, so on and so forth, right? And they really spoke to the local market itself. So I think you nailed it on the head, Bilal, with this kind of idea of like, well, why does Google focus on next billion? Or, how do you really think about kind of value capture in these markets? The real value capture is going to, for these ecosystems and markets, themselves.
What was the value?
The last part you said it cut off at the key part.
The value capture is something. No, we're leaving all this in because it's hilarious.
Yeah. Behind the scenes, there you go.
This guy was giving alpha. Romeen was giving free alpha, and then the value capture, the meaning of life is blank. And it's
I bet Wi-Fi doesn't go out in India like it does in Atlanta.
The Wi-Fi definitely doesn't go out in India. I think this
what was the value capture part?
The value capture, yeah. So the value capture that's there for investing in Indian companies is looking at basically these native use cases.
Okay.
Right? So that's where the real opportunities are going to come. The real opportunities are not going to come from just trying to put a Western model on.
That's amazing. I love that.
I love that.
Ship Rocket's actually a perfect example of like the market structure developing and how different it is. But there's something that I don't want to forget this because I saw it on Bilal's notes. You brought up something super interesting, Romeen. Is like, okay, so let's set the framework. You're saying, this is the demographics, super attractive. But then you brought up a very interesting sociological perspective. Is like, India is actually not a huge consumer society relative to America, for example. They, as in this country, and again, this is calling, again, a monolith is not correct, but long-term assets. Can you explain this idea of longer-term assets, which is what a lot of Indian consumers, they're not consuming the way that we might expect.
And actually, Romeen, just to add 1 5-second wrinkle on that too, is you also said Indian consumers are more like CFOs than CMOs. So just to build on top of that, I think that's related.
Cooking.
Yeah, so there's a lot there. So let's try to unpack it. So one is culturally, right? Indians are very different consumers, right? So the way that India thinks about, or Indian consumers think, is they spend a lot of money on what they perceive as what you guys just called these long-term assets, right? So that's education, health, real estate, gold, right? So almost 20% of the world's gold is actually held by Indian retail consumers, right? Which not many people
incredible, isn't it?
Yeah, it's incredible.
Now, when Indians actually think to purchase, right, there's an opposite side of this of when you're forming a business, how do you think about the Indian consumer, right? So we can talk about that a little bit. That ties into kind of my perspective on why super apps, et cetera, work in Asian countries and they don't work, at all in US countries. And I think the latest example of somebody trying to build a super app is Elon and Twitter. So we can talk a little bit about some of those parallels. But Indian consumers themselves are exactly, Bilal, to what you mentioned that I framed was Indian consumers are more like CFOs than they are CMOs, right? So they're very careful with their money. They're very prudent. They're constantly trying to save money. CMOs are dreamers, storytellers, brand conscious, et cetera, right? And as you see this kind of Westernification happening of the consumer class, you see Indians moving more and more to being like CMOs as opposed to CFOs, right? Where they are extreme CMOs is not just long-term assets. Let's put the long-term assets aside because that really speaks to more of a savings culture. But where do they actually spend the money? There's 2 archetypes. They spend the money on education, healthcare, and weddings. And when they spend the money on education, healthcare, and weddings, it's like a massive knockout punch, right? So on weddings, for example, Indians will spend 10 to 20 times their annual earnings on weddings.
It's insane.
That's insane, right?
Like it's totally crazy if you think about it.
Objectively, hold on a second. I'm going to ask objectively.
That's crazy.
I'm not moralizing here. That is not a good use of money.
Yeah, and so it speaks to this broader. It speaks to this broader
cultural thing
notion,
too,
right? It's a cultural thing. So it speaks to this broader cultural notion, which is actually really interesting when you look at individual like SKUs or specific products. So if I told you, where do you guys think the gross margins are higher when you're creating products that are selling to Indian consumers? Do you think it's on collective products, right, or do you think it's on individual products? And what do I mean by that? So individual products are like a Rolex watch, for example. It's for you, the individual, right? Collective is, for family, for society, et cetera. Where do you think the gross margins are higher?
Collective.
Significantly higher.
Okay, so wait, are you pushing back on me saying objectively this is a bad use? Okay, well, I am wrong
I'm
because
agreeing
objectively.
with you. I'm agreeing with you. I'm just saying there is a deep kind of cultural, imprint that is very difficult to, which is this idea of, it actually goes to, I think, a really strong strength of the country, which is the country is highly communal versus individualistic.
Yeah.
Right? And so because it's communal, right, what you actually see is like, for example, right, very classic thing when you renovate a high-end home in America is you go to the master bathroom and it's unbelievable, right? That's a very individual notion, right?
I like that example.
A very individual notion of consumerism. If you think about it.
Marble floors,
marble,
Is it
gold
first
glass,
things?
87 showers that are happening that you're never going to use. It's the epitome of individualistic culture because who is spending time in that bathroom, right? Only you. Whereas Indians, if you go to any Indian person's living room,
Where
like
Trung writes his best threads, to be fair.
Yeah.
I'm sure
well,
that's the
that is
concentration
definitely
time.
true.
Yeah.
That is definitely true.
So in Indian living rooms are bawling.
If you look at Indian living rooms
Yeah.
compared to Indian individual rooms, they're bigger, they're more stacked out, right? There's more products there,
You
etc.
got that chandelier dripping from the ceiling. You know?
It speaks to this very kind of core idea of, when there's community or there's something to show people, Indians will spend a lot of money. And when it's upon themselves, individualistically, they actually won't spend a ton of money, right? So this notion of kind of the Indian consumer, understanding that the Indian consumer is more like a CFO than a CMO, is actually really interesting to figure out kind of where do you play. Now, there's two other components of this. So one is this kind of CFO-CMO ratio is changing wildly, right? So if you actually look at, Indians even from a body type, a physique perspective, et cetera, why are people in Asian countries typically skinnier, smaller, et cetera? It actually turns out that there's, lack of commercialization around fast food, right? And so as you see fast food or you see more kind of Western kind of ideals actually infiltrate the country, you actually see a lot of the, same types of issues, et cetera, that, people in the US have with health, right? And so the CMO, CFO concept is changing significantly with Westernization of culture. So that's one thing that's interesting in the Indian consumer. The other thing that's interesting in the Indian consumer, let's talk about this kind of from the flip, from a business perspective, right? So if you're actually building a business, how do you think about the Indian consumer? You have to build horizontally versus vertically. And so what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is the Indian consumer base itself is not deep enough from a wallet perspective to spend loads of money, right? So in America, you can build one individual idea and go into a consumer, right? And they're going to spend galore, right, on the product or on the service that you have. In India, that's not the case based on the the four categories of India we were talking about earlier. So what happens? What happens in India is you have large conglomerate companies that basically build everything under the sun, right? From your cars to your internet, right? The Tatas, the Reliances, et cetera, is the world. And so what they do is they say, you know what, we can't go deep with any one individual consumer, right? In terms of, just Wi-Fi or just car or just, XYZ. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to go identify Trung and we're going to sell Trung literally everything he buys. Everything.
I want the Tata Lassie. Yo, give me the Tata car. Give me the Tata Lassie. Give me the Tata jeans. I want all that Tata.
You'll have all of it. You will all literally be from one brand, right? Or Reliance or so on and so forth, right? And so it's pretty interesting, when you think about the way that large businesses are built in India, it's actually, for Indian startups, and this goes very, very opposite of what the typical advice or focus is for startups is, focus is key, focus is key. That's a very Western principle, right? Because if you just focus on one kind of small thing, it turns out there's not that many, significantly sized markets in India, at least from a monetization perspective, not from a usage perspective. You can get 1 billion Indian users, right? If in America, somebody showed you a consumer app with 1 billion users, you'd get super excited. You'd be like, this is unbelievable. This is literally Facebook, right? You can get hundreds of millions of users in India, right? And it's never going to convert, right, into actual dollars. And so when you're building, when you kind of think about from the business's perspective, this is why you kind of have these like conglomerate businesses, in India itself. So a lot is changing in terms of the consumers themselves, how they mentally think. A lot is also changing in terms of how, businesses are building. Obviously, as that Westernization happens, businesses can go narrower and narrower. But the biggest businesses in India are very much so the ones that are built, for these horizontal use cases.
I think a great example of this, sorry, a super quick point here is whenever you look at these earnings calls from like Netflix or like Facebook, it's like ARPU, average revenue per user, United States, $30. It's like India is like 50 cents. I think that's just like, that always gets me, right? It's just like, I think the Disney Plus example is a great one because when they said they had 100 million users in whatever, 6 to 12 months, it was like 50 million users are from Hotstar India, right? It's like the ARPU is like under $1 for that. But anyways, wow.
Absolutely.
No, that's a really good point. I think the stuff you talked about, like the cultural nuance there, even earlier, the kind of last mile logistics, like these are all things you won't know unless you start studying and spending time in the market. So the other thing you mentioned, I love the framing around CFO versus CMO. You mentioned the CFOs, they care about, you've done a couple threads on this, but this one you wrote about education, health, real estate, and gold. I think you gave a different example a second ago. The gold, I do want to dig into that just because it's an incredible stat, right? Like almost 20% of the world's the world's gold is held by Indian retail consumers. And I think in our world, in tech, especially with the cryptocurrency discussion and Bitcoin being framed as a digital gold and being this long-term store of value narrative that we've seen in the last few years here, you can argue if that's real or not, but even the CEO of BlackRock is started using that phrase. I'm curious what you think about the perception of cryptocurrencies and something like a Bitcoin becoming something in the long run there, because just from my perspective as N of one, a lot of this is not just to do with, oh, I'm going to hold gold in my, safe at home. This is aunties like my mom wearing gold at the weddings, balling out. And then also it's a dowry thing, right? And when someone gets married, you give this gold as a dowry. So I'm curious your perception of that as someone who's actually spent more time in the market.
Yeah, that's right. So this idea, I think this is kind of like this is a great example of a Western trope. So a Western trope would be, okay, you have 20% of the world's 20% of the world's gold in the hands of Indian retail investors. Indians clearly like gold. What we could do is we could create a digital gold, and that's going to really take off, right? And what that misses is the exact kind of cultural attenuation that you spoke to, right? Which is, it turns out that, well, let's ask ourselves from first principles, why do Indians love gold, right? One part of it absolutely is a social piece, right? The other part of it is a religious piece, right? So if you think of, Hindu mythology and you think of all the gods, etc., they are lathered in gold, right? And so there's a lot of religious symbolism to gold itself. I don't think you're going to sit down for, a puja or celebrate Diwali and you're going to put out your cryptocurrency wallet. Like, that's not going to happen, right? And so...
unless it's a hard wallet that's plated in gold.
Right,
there we go. There's
a hard wallet plated in gold.
Niche.
And then congratulations.
Ledger, get on that.
And then congratulations, you just created a brick of gold and defeated the purpose of having cryptocurrency. So the importance of gold is really deeply cultural, right? I think from look, I'm not a crypto expert, but what I can say is from a regulatory perspective, India is not nearly the friendliest country in the world for crypto. And so I think it's going to be really, really challenging, right? In terms of, young Indians adopting, crypto generally. I think even if they do adopt crypto, it's going to be very different than kind of for this analogy of like digital gold, right? I think gold holds a very specific, cultural importance, cultural place in Indian society, in Indian culture, which is, culturally backed, religiously backed, socially backed, right? And that's very, very difficult to change.
Yeah. And just one other piece of context I'll share is just, again, from my perception being Pakistani, very similar cultures, obviously, though there's some differences with, obviously there's lots of Muslims in India. I think even more Muslims in India than the whole of Pakistan's population. But, Pakistan is primarily a Muslim country. But there is this similarity in kind of mindset. When people get married, it's like two families coming together. And you kind of have had that in the West in the past, but I think we've moved much more to an individualistic culture here, which is more about, these two people coming together. And there is a little bit about the families coming together, but in our cultures is the families are like, have a massive say. They're the ones you're hosting the other family, like stuff like that. So there's just a very big difference. And I think like even in Islamic religion, there is a dowry part of that when you're getting married too. So there's a lot of things there that I think people would miss with that. The last couple of things I wanted to add, and then I know Trung probably had other questions as well, was just this one really surprised me, was the consumers are primarily men. You said less than 7% of the urban female population has independent final income. Just for contrast, that's 90% in China. So just the
that's
complete...
Crazy.
That's crazy, right? Even in the West, I think when you're targeting, if you're selling a product for the home or you're, the decision is being made primarily by the woman in the house. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think this is what speaks to like, how do you build products and where do you have to target, in India, right? So less than 7% of the urban female population has independent financial income, right? Staggeringly low compared to China. All financial products, credit cards, home loans, investments, et cetera, they're all, bought by men. One of the things that one of the founders in India shared with me that was really surprising was 50% of shopping on female fashion portals in India have men shopping for their significant others.
That's incredible, right?
Right?
Just that.
You're trying to get those patented jeans, dude.
Yeah.
Patented jeans.
And so India is probably, one of the only countries in the world where the fashion spend of men is more than women, right? And other
That's
markets,
mind-boggling.
women's fashion spend is 5 to 7x that of men. So I think it speaks to, again, how do you have to build products and how do you have to think? Now, one conclusion from what I just said would be, it's not an attractive market to build, for women. In many senses, it's the complete opposite. You can really, really corral very strong brand power as well, because there is that, disproportionate skew in independent income and in consumer spend, right? So it's very interesting. These are the types of interesting nuances when you dig in, beyond kind of the monolithic idea of India's, 1.5 billion people or so. These are the exact types of nuances, et cetera, that you start to see.
So for the listeners, thank you so much for the India Alpha. There's a lot there. Ledger, go make that gold-plated hard wallet. So I do want to point listeners to the, we'll have it in the show notes, but Return on India was a podcast series. I would say this. I would say listen to the last episode first, actually, the Romeen on reviewing India's opportunities. I don't know if you agree with that, but Romeen basically recaps everything he did over this series. He was on the ground for a lot of these interviews. He's got some crazy ones. And our friend Matt Rizzo from Colossus interviewed him for that last one. But do you have any episodes from your series that you would point people to?
I think if you're interested in emerging economies, just generally, like India, I think is one of the most interesting ones. But if you're thinking about investing globally or just emerging countries, I think the best couple would be one I did with this guy named Sajid Pai, who's at Bloom Ventures in India. Really, really great, thinker, and really has some great frameworks on how to think about the country in parallels to other countries. So that one was one that I think was really foundational to if you're trying to understand the country. The second one, which I feel so fortunate I was able to do, was with this guy named Nandan Nilekani. So Nandan Nilekani was the founder of Infosys, billionaire founder of Infosys, incredibly humble, incredibly important second act in his career, which is serving as India's CTO. So a lot of what actually kickstarted India's progress and a lot of what these startups are relying on, things like UPI, the Universal Payments Interface, the Aadhaar card, which gave digital identity to everybody in India, was his doing and his founding in collaboration with the government. And so that was a really interesting episode on what's possible, when you think of scale and when you think of kind of, private market expertise and public sector actually partnering. There were two other ones that I thought were notably really interesting as well. One was with this guy named Kunal Shah, who founded a company called Cred. Their last round was 5-6 billion or so, but one of the popular fintech companies in India. A lot of these kind of subtle social insights came from him, and I think were really interesting. And then there was a deep dive episode actually with the Shiprocket founder. And I thought that was a really good example if you wanted to go really deep kind of on that example we talked about and get a good understanding of, again, just abstracting as a framework, right? For when you're thinking about investing in another country, how do you think about a native use case, for that country? That was a really good kind of real life example. It was a lot of fun. Matt, Patrick O'Shaughnessy, the Colossus team are great. They were great to collaborate and partner with, on that series. And, I think we heard from folks that listened to the whole series that, certainly if you were interested in India, I think it was interesting. And even if not, and you were interested in other kind of investing in other emerging markets, there are a lot of parallels that you could draw from.
It's a crash course, man. People just listen to 2X. Romeen's got a great voice, as you're hearing right now. And then after 4 hours, you'll be an expert in India. So super quick question was, when you interviewed Nandan, who, did I say it correctly? Which is the founder.
Yep.
You did that in India, yeah?
I did that when I was when I was in India. We did it remotely, but then I had the chance to follow up with him when I was in Bangalore, actually the week after that, I think, and spend, about a half a day with him.
How was his living room? Was it nice? Was it a good living room?
We met in the office, and the communal parts of the office were very nice.
The bathrooms need a little bit of work. It was a little bit small.
The individualistic elements of the office needed some work. but it was great. He's unbelievable.
He's a G. He's the absolute G. He's like in the country's tech scene. So,
well, Romeen, I'm just curious on that. Sorry, Trung. How was your trip to India? Because I don't know if you grew up going to India as a kid, as like an adult going. Like, what was it like going with that hat on, being like, I'm looking at from a business point of view, and like different to going when you're 12 years old, like having lassi in the summertime, you know what I mean?
For sure. Yeah. I mean, all these things became real, right? Like they became very real. These things, you can go read in some Morgan Stanley wealth management report and get excited and say, oh, it's a big market and this, that, and the other. And then, India's a country of juxtaposition. So then you go on the street and the guy that's like knocking on your door, kind of pounding you down because he wants you to give you money, et cetera. Right. In one hand, you're saying, hey, he's like, can you give me 50 rupees? Right. Can you give me 70 rupees? Right. 80 rupees is $1 for everybody that's listening. Right. Can you give me 80 rupees? Can you give me 80 rupees? And then he's whipping out his smartphone and he has a QR code for you to give him that 80 rupees. Right. So you look and you're like, what a country of juxtaposition where there's still these very real problems. It's not that he's, kind of pulling a scam or anything like that. It just speaks to, how advanced the country actually is, which is people on the side of the road that are asking for funds, are asking with their smartphone and a QR code, right? And so there's these wild juxtapositions for how the country actually operates. I think the youthfulness, the optimism, the ambition is certainly next level. India is, when you have that many people in a country and it's a poor country and the spaces are relatively enclosed, and this is not to say that, this is certainly not still the case, but oftentimes you just, infrastructure is not great. It's dirty. It's, smelly. It's old, et cetera. And I think one thing that was really exciting and interesting to see, and you can only really see this on the ground, is just the sheer level of pride that I'd say India's youth takes in the country, right? And so like small cultural things of like, if somebody throws, when I was growing up, if we went on, a train or railway or something and somebody, threw trash or, on the side of the road or, in the car or whatever it was, it's just kind of accepted that, this is how India is, right? But now you actually see, you see signs in English, you see kind of almost cultural shaming of like, if you're, creating rubbish, et cetera, there is this real, culture and this real vibe, right? Of people saying, hey, wait a minute, maybe we shouldn't operate it this way, right? Maybe we should operate differently. And so it's a very, very different, it's a very different world over there. It's a very different world. As I was sharing earlier, you literally cannot tell if you were talking to a young Indian that's proficient in English on Zoom, you could not tell if they were in San Francisco or they were in Bangalore, which I think is probably the best microcosm or the best way to explain, what's really going on, over there.
Yeah. Love it.
And when you see somebody's resume with IIT on it, the Indian Institute of Technology, all you need to know is this guy could have gone to Harvard. This guy could
all
have
you
gone
need to know is they
around.
are one of 10,000 people that pass this standardized test that literally, scores of tens of millions of people take every single year. And, I'm not sure what's more impressive than
IIT is probably more impressive, actually. I would put in my head, I have IIT like on par with MIT. Like that's how I think about it.
Yeah, it has to be. It has to be. Yeah.
So, quick pivot here on this.
Sure.
We're pivoting from India. Although it's a quick question. We got to do one more India question. What's your favorite Indian dish, and why is it palak paneer?
Oh, that's easy. It's any type of paneer. That's super easy. In fact, when I was at McKinsey, I was traveling to London all the time because I had a project there, and I was probably hanging out at. Well, I'm curious, Bilal, what your take is, but I was hanging out at a lot of the locals, or at least seemingly the tourists, are at Dishoom.
Oh, yeah. Did you enjoy Dishoom?
Yeah, it's great.
It's awesome. The best, right? I've actually just started seeing, I was at someone's house for dinner like a few days ago. Twice in 3 days, I saw the Dishoom book in there, and I'm in New York.
We have it in our house.
It's a great little cooking book, actually. And if you're ever in London, definitely recommend it. I'd also recommend Tayyib's or Lahore Kebab House, one of the kind of OGs sort of places. Trung, did you go to any of these when you were there recently?
I did not. I should have asked.
Next time.
I should have asked.
Dishoom is definitely, because I know you were on your Pret diet there because you were making up for that hotel you were balling out.
I was staying in Knightsbridge, so I had to save money the other way. Eating at
Nando's. On the shawarma diet.
And shawarma. But so paneer's your go-to, Romeen.
Yes,
paneer, you're a paneer guy. Okay.
Usually best in India. For sure.
Oh, yeah,
Beautiful.
that's the best. All right, Trung, over to you, mate, because I know we went to
Okay.
about bootstrap businesses as well.
Yeah.
Rameen, thanks
So-
for breaking that down. That was brilliant, man.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it was amazing,
absolutely.
dude. I'll throw two. I'll let Romeen pick here because Romeen sent me a Google Doc. He's very meticulous, and he has this idea called tech-enabled service businesses as a source of alpha. That's a mouthful. So you can either talk through that, or can you throw us like 5 bootstrap businesses or 3 bootstrap businesses that you love? Because what people need to know about Romeen is he has a one foot in both worlds, right? Cash flowing workforce management business that he runs, and then the invested in nearly 100 tech companies. So you're vocal about saying, the bootstrap way makes a lot of sense, but you have credibility on that. So actually, why don't we just go with bootstrap? Why don't you talk through your bootstrap philosophy and then some crazy ideas you have that people could potentially jump on?
So maybe be helpful. And the reason I sent that doc to you, Trung, I've been thinking about this a lot lately, right? And part of it is because of the hive mind of just, let's say being online and being on something like Twitter, right? Which is you have these kind of like culture wars breakout, right? You have people that are like bootstrap businesses are the way to build businesses. And then you have people that say, no, you're building a bootstrap business, you're just not ambitious as an entrepreneur, right? And then some people say, cash flow is king, and others say, no, you should be building for enterprise value. And there's all these kind of like, almost like culture war arguments against one another. And what it led me to believe, or what it led me down this path of, and you're right, I have a foot in both worlds, was, are these businesses actually more different than they are similar, right? The punchline is today, they're incredibly different. There's no question about it. But what I started thinking about is in the future, are they actually, more similar, or are they more different? So this idea that I have is this idea that I've kind of been wrapping a lot in my head is this idea that I think in a world in which you're kind of looking for alpha, right? Alpha means kind of additional returns, et cetera, or areas of arbitrage. I think one of the most interesting areas of alpha and kind of generating returns is going to be tech-enabled services businesses. Okay, so why do I believe that? So in software, right, or in SaaS, there's this adage, right, that's kind of been taken as just like common knowledge and common convention, which is if you want to be $1 billion company, right, you need to get to $100 million in revenue, right? And this idea was made pretty popular and taken as conventional wisdom by the folks at Battery Ventures, right? They created this framework called T2D3, which is triple, triple, double, double, double. So the idea is basically you get to, around $1 million-ish in annual recurring revenue. And then you follow that trajectory, right? Triple, triple, double, double, double. Then within 5-ish years, you're at $100 million in revenue. You slap a 10x revenue multiple and voila, you're worth $1 billion, right? So the revenue part makes sense. You get to 100 million in revenue, but we've taken it as just such common knowledge that, oh, if you're a SaaS company, you can give, a 10x multiple or so because, there's public markets, there's enough of these companies out there, it's efficient enough. But if you really dig underneath as to why do you get a 10x multiple, what does that actually mean, right? I think it's because there's 3 assumptions that you're principally making about the business. So one is stable, predictable top line growth, right? So if you just do the math, right, you need a company to basically grow at 15% year over year for the next decade, right, to justify kind of paying, that much ahead, right? So that's the first piece. Second piece is it's not just about the actual growth itself; it's about the construct of the business, right? So there's really good margins, right? So the business can produce, let's say, at least 30%, contribution margin, right, which generates enough cash flow. And then the last one is kind of similar to the first one, but it's a little bit different, which is endurance, right? So the company is going to be basically around, a decade from now, right? It's either going to have, it's going to be around in its current form, it's going to have adjusted its business model enough, but the bottom line is, the quality of the business has stayed consistent versus having decayed, right? So people typically give, this type of valuation or this type of multiple to software businesses, right, SaaS businesses, because they have some characteristics which really justify those assumptions. So one is all revenue is recurring, right? So you have predictability around it. And the second is the gross margin profile of software is really attractive, right? These businesses are 60, 70, 80% gross margins. And so at scale, recurring revenue points towards stability, predictability, endurance, while software gross margins give, more credence toward this idea of healthy contribution margins, right? Now, when you think of most great SaaS businesses, right, they have always had services businesses attached to them. I think that's like the great marketing, like wazoo of what these companies have done, which is they've always had, implementation services, managed services, support services, et cetera, because it turns out that, especially if you're selling in the enterprise or so, people don't want to buy just technology for the sake of buying technology. They actually want to buy a solution, right?
Romeen, like Salesforce, for example, is has
100%.
like a massive
they're
part.
on the ground. They're building you some custom stuff.
Yeah,
like
they need
Ability
to
AI,
get,
for example.
yeah.
If you
There
want
we
to
go.
close a $10 million contract, I will hold your hand.
There
I
we
will
go.
literally fly and hold your hand. Otherwise, you can use the do-it-yourself
Out
stuff.
the box, to be fair. Yeah.
The Salesforce is a perfect example because there's a massive ecosystem of Salesforce consulting firms, right? And these guys are running around and basically saying, hey, we're experts in Salesforce and we'll do the work for you, right? But even internally in Salesforce, there's a massive, consulting or services, et cetera, division, right? And so despite having, services businesses having lower margin profiles, right, not being as recurring, et cetera, by having a small portion of that revenue composition, these SaaS companies still got away with saying that, hey, the entirety of the company, right, is still a quote unquote technology company, right? And it's because, look, the blended gross margin of these businesses was still over 60%, right? So you kind of have this trope of, services or software as a proxy for like quality and valuation, right? Services businesses, scaled services businesses trade at 10x, earnings as opposed to 10x revenue, right? And if you kind of really dig into the why, it again kind of comes back to those whys that I was saying below. Margins are lower, business isn't recurring, right? It's more of a leap of faith of, is this stable, predictable, and enduring growth? But then I started thinking, I said, okay, well, what if you create a services business that has the same characteristics as a legacy software company, right? And if you did that, would it get the same valuation as a legacy software company, right? So almost think of like the Coke and Pepsi blind test, right? If I put two businesses in front of you, blindfolded you, right? And one was services and one was software, right? Like, would you ascribe the same exact valuation to the both of them if they had all the same underlying characteristics, right? And I think historically, right, you could not have done that. Now I think you can actually do that with AI and with global talent, right? So there was a company that I talked to the other day, services business, and they broke down their delivery, right? I won't blow up exactly what they do because I wanted to keep it secretive, but I'll break down kind of at a high level the way they thought about their delivery, right? Which was basically like they're executing their service. So they broke it down into two modals, okay? So they said, if we had humans do the first part, modal 1, and humans do the second part, modal 2, we can produce a 40% gross margin business, okay? Then they said human modal 1, AI modal 2, you can do 55% gross margin. AI modal 1 and human modal 2, we can do 75% gross margin. AI modal 1, AI modal 2, we can do 90% gross margin. Now that was really interesting to me, right? Because what I started thinking about is, okay, if you could deliver one part of the solution via AI and one part with the right human team, right? We just spent the whole first half of the podcast talking about India. So let's talk about, getting lower cost talent in a place like India and blending it, right? Not just having US talent. Then what you start to end up seeing is, you can end up having a really high gross margin business. And if you think of the nature of those services, right, which are typically implementation, managed services, et cetera, right, you solve the recurring part, right? So one of the things that we learned through COVID was software company recurring revenue is actually a lot less recurring than we thought, right? You were getting on the phone and basically saying, hey, ZoomInfo, if you don't cut your price by half tomorrow, I'm churning. So it turns out these long-term software contracts were getting flipped off, in a second. The other thing is, when you think of, large enterprise consulting firms, the Accentures and such of the world, it turns out that their consulting contracts are significantly longer than software contracts, which are typically one-year contracts. So if you could solve the gross margin and the margin profile of the business, and you could solve the recurring revenue part of the business, I actually think you can start to think about services businesses from a valuation perspective, the same way as you could think of traditional software companies. So, if you ascribe that idea, I think in the 2010s, we kind of mistook every startup to be a software company. We valued Uber, Airbnb, DoorDash. We valued all of them as pure software businesses. Turns out they were not pure software businesses. I think we might be doing the opposite right now with services businesses. And if we are, there's a lot of alpha sitting underneath the surface. So the right agency, services, consulting, et cetera, business that kind of looks like that small, cute cash flow company on the surface may very well be, tomorrow's unicorn. So I think
no investment advice. Hold on a second. So Accenture then, for example,
not
could you
investment
talk through
advice.
that? What do you think
Go
about
ahead.
Accenture? What do you think about Accenture?
Well, Accenture just closed $400 million of consulting contracts. Sorry, $100 million of consulting contracts that are focused on AI specifically, right, over the last 4 months.
So you think
And
this is super bullish for them?
I think it's super bullish for them.
Okay.
And the reason why is, and it's a little bit different. I think some of the components of what I just talked about definitely apply, right, to them. They are large, consulting. They are large services businesses, so they can absolutely be tech enabled. They can absolutely be more thoughtful, et cetera. I don't think those businesses are the ones necessarily that will really fall into this, bucket, because I think those are 1.0 services companies, right? They've been built with a very different infrastructure and foundation than services companies will be built from today. Smaller businesses that are starting today can be built AI first, remote first, et cetera. But those businesses, well, they'll go through their transformation, but they're not structurally the same as the types of businesses I'm talking about here. The reason those companies will do really well, though, is because they are going through there's a huge tectonic technological shift the world is going through. So the McKinseys, the Bains, the Accentures, et cetera, of the world, they do their best when there is a massive new super cycle that sets off, right? Why? Because every company is asking, well, what does AI mean for us? What is our AI strategy? How are we going to incorporate AI? What does it mean for the landscape that we operate in? What does it mean for our delivery? What does it mean for our consumer products, et cetera, right? So those companies, I think, will do really well because they're going to ride a technology shift. I'm more so speaking to businesses that if you were getting a services business off the ground today and you spent too much time on Twitter and you got faced with this trope that services business is going to be a small, cute cash flow company and it's for the non-ambitious. My sentiment or my thesis is actually, I think you can use the data and you can kind of use the profile of how these businesses are constructed to actually refute that claim.
Love it. Just trying, I don't know if you had a direct follow-up to that. Go on.
No, I was just going to say, Romeen, so you've been cooking on this just recently. Like, this is like the thing you send me. It's not even, this is just thoughts you're putting together right now.
This is thoughts, yeah. But I think it's because we often, what often does not happen when we think about companies. So just think about how common it is to be like if you're investing in a company today, right? How common it is to just assume, oh, it's a tech company, it'll trade at 10x ARR. And, so I'll invest at 40x ARR or something because, with scale and growth rate and over a period of time, even though I'm investing at 40x today, it's on a small number, right? This is a very classic VC model, right? So a very classic VC model, forget portfolio construction, et cetera. Very simple. It's okay. This business is doing 3 million in ARR. Maybe I'll give it a, $60 million valuation, right? I'll give it a 20x kind of valuation or so. And the thing I'm betting on is that, this company can do, 60 million in ARR. And at that point in time, it'll terminally trade, at 10 times. And so there'll be multiple compression. It's not going to trade at the same entry multiple that I gave 20x. It's going to be at, let's say, 10x. Maybe it'll be at 5x, whatever, right? It'll be something significantly lower on the multiple side. But from the absolute dollars from a revenue perspective, it's not going to be 3. It's going to be more like 30, 60, 300, 600, et cetera. And so the math, right, early on is I did, the company's at 3 million in revenue and I gave it a 20x multiple. So it's valued at 60 million. And hopefully in the future, it's going to do, 100 million in revenue and it's going to be a 10x multiple. And so it's going to be worth $1 billion. And along the way, they're going to raise a bunch more money. And so it's going to, my stake is going to continue to dilute. So maybe I own 50%, of the stake instead of 100% of my stake because it'll continue to dilute. And the end number of all of that is this company will be worth 600 million as opposed to 60 million. I made a 10x investment over some period of time, 3 years, 5 years, 7 years, whatever it might be, right? So I just started thinking of, okay, well, if that's the back of the envelope math that we ascribe, and that's really the back of the envelope heuristic that, many of the most sophisticated investors in the world, do. When people talk about, hey, if you can't do the deal on the back of a napkin, don't do the deal. I think they often ascribe it to some philosophical, amazingness of how, they've distilled this incredibly complex problem into something super simple. And it's this proof point of just, very strong, deduction of logic. I think the reality is the math is just not that hard, right? The reason you do it on the back of an envelope or the back of a napkin is because the math has 3 variables.
You don't need any more space.
Yeah, it turns out you don't actually need more than a napkin to say, what's the multiple? What's the growth rate? How much am I going to get diluted? It turns out you can do that on the back of a napkin, right? It's not this like amazing, like, Albert Einstein level of synthesis that's going on here. So I think if you have the thought process that, okay, companies get valued like that, then, you have public markets, right? You have these large companies in public markets that trade and you can see their valuation. Then I think what you really have to ask yourself is, okay, well, why does a company ultimately get a valuation? A company ultimately gets a valuation because of the amount of future cash flow that it's going to generate. And so when you're ascribing, these shorthand kind of heuristics like multiples, et cetera, you're making some statement of belief of the cash flow potential of the business, right? Either it's scale, either it's endurance, either it's percentage, like if you put $1 in, how many, cents are going to come out from a cash flow perspective. And so if you just take those, those underlying variables and you separate all the noise of kind of narratives and marketing and, like common knowledge of if it's a SaaS company, it's going to get a 10x multiple, whatever it is. And you actually think from first principles, I think there was really good reason before why a scaled services company would trade at 10x profit versus 10x revenue, right? I think software and SaaS, and these were really, these were truly, fundamental shifts to the underlying business models, recurring revenue, much higher margins, et cetera. But I think a lot of these services companies are going to be powered by the same things now. And if that's the case, then it really begs the question that, well, wait a minute, why wouldn't these companies be valued the exact same way? And so I think like I said earlier, I think we made the mistake in the last decade of saying Uber, DoorDash, Airbnb, every single one of these just valued as software. And turned out these are not software businesses. They have a lot of software, but there's nothing, software about a guy bringing you your pizza. I mean, that is a real world problem, right? Uber, right?
Delicious real world problems.
Is a delicious real world problem. Uber is a real world problem, right? I mean, these are real world problems. They're enabled by technology, but they are real world problems that have very, very different cost structures, very different, economic outcomes. And I think that a lot of these consulting businesses, services businesses, et cetera, that are being built today will look a lot more like the 1.0 SaaS companies that were built in 2008, 2009, 2010 because of AI, because of global talent, et cetera. And so if you look in public markets and you say that, well, those companies trade at 10 times revenue, what's the argument for why these companies can't trade at 10 times revenue? And I think that's the alpha, right? That's the zone where it turns out that if you're building, and then if we take it one level deeper, right? If these businesses are actually well capitalized. So let's talk about the bootstrapped versus venture thing, right? Well, it turns out that if you own 50% of it or 100% of it or so, right? Versus owning 10% as a VC-backed founder, right? Your company can be 1/10 the size. I think there's going to be a lot of founders that are running around, creating, $10 to $50 million exits for themselves that are just going to be building incredibly thoughtfully capitalized companies that are just well run and well operated with small teams because of AI and global talent. Like, I think it's going to be really interesting how many of these businesses, are actually going to take off and be, much bigger and much better outcomes than what traditionally you would have thought of in these types of companies.
Well, Romeen, you've obviously built a similar company in this space, right? So, and I don't know if when you started that, you had this frame around it, or if this has developed later around being able to create a more scalable sort of service offering. But curious to get your thoughts on like actual categories of consultant service businesses that this could work for beyond the ones you might have mentioned. Like if for a smaller business entrepreneur, meaning not a public market, and we're not trying to invest in someone, we're saying we want to start something like this. What are the sort of categories that you'd be looking at for this?
Yeah. So this is another thing I think that's really interesting about like bootstrap businesses or services businesses, et cetera. I think people often take this very strong concept from technology of, competitive landscape and so on and so forth and try to ascribe it right to these types of businesses. We operate, you could say one segment of our business is in the staffing space, right? Finding people, placing people, et cetera. There's over 250 companies in the US that do over $100 million a year in revenue that are staffing companies, right? And so when I think about it, Bilal, I actually don't even think of like, is there a certain category specifically that this can get ascribed to? What I think of is you chase a really large market and you just build a better business, right? I mean, like your grandfather's staffing business, has physical branches in the different states. Well, it turns out that that's really expensive, right? Versus working online or versus working in remote. So I think this applies to all, consulting, services. There's some categories that are better than others, but I think that this fundamental concept applies, to any one of these, services.
Across the board.
Across the board. One of the ideas that I'm excited about right now, though, and I'm curious to get your guys' take on it, is so you see all this hype and wave, obviously, around AI, right? And I think AI is different than crypto. Like, I do think it's real. We're seeing it's real. We see that there's real tangible business value. It's also not a big leap of faith, right? You see automation, et cetera, inside companies, et cetera, anyways. But I'm not convinced that you can make a bunch of money startup investing right now in AI. I think actually a lot of the economic value is going to accrue to really, really big players. And I think you're going to have a graveyard of a bunch of companies that raised 10, 20, $50 million. And it turns out there's nothing enduring about those businesses. Where I do think you can make money, though, is in certainly using AI in your services business, et cetera. But if you were thinking about the automation in the AI space specifically, I think somebody's going to build a really interesting pick and shovels consulting firm specifically targeted around AI. And I think this is actually where I would think of how do you apply these ideas, because you'd kind of like kill two birds with one stone. So one is, you would be propagating and helping companies think about AI, diagnose, their companies, give them a roadmap on how AI or automation can help their organizations, actually provide a game plan on how those organizations should incorporate AI, the business value will generate, potentially build plugins, deploy products, right, et cetera, and then ongoing maintenance, right, of like, what is the AI stack? So things will continue to break, automations will continue to need to be fixed, you'll need help desk, support, et cetera. And so I think somebody can build a really, really good AI consulting firm or an AI automation consulting firm that really helps businesses and kind of grabs onto this tailwind. But at the same time, I think what they can do is they can take them like a massive amount of advantage of what we were just talking about by incorporating all those practices into their own consulting firm itself.
This is so meta. This is it.
Right?
Hold on. Let me summarize for the listeners. Romeen is proposing you create a consulting firm to help companies transitioning to AI, or they want AI in their technology stack. You're going to help them. But the consulting firm you're building is going to be run by AI.
The consulting firm you're building is going to be, so some part of it certainly is going to be automated, run by AI, et cetera, but it's going to be run in the way that we were talking about, kind of the prior thesis, right? It's going to be run with the right blend of onshore, offshore, and AI. And so, you can get that kind of like value accretion, right, or valuation, right, of a legacy 1.0 technology business. And why not, right? Like if ultimately that kind of business is doing a couple $100 million in revenue and it's doing it at 30, 40%, 50% EBITDA, for example, right? Which sounds outlandish to think about, but I don't actually think is all that outlandish when you like think of the math. Well, why wouldn't that company, why could that company not get valued as we value kind of public SaaS companies today? I mean, a lot of the SaaS companies that we value today are, in my opinion, to be honest, they're monikering as technology companies. It's really a bunch of services slapped on with like some tech, right? And there's a reason why their gross margins are like 50%, 40%, right? They're not actually software businesses.
This is the most alpha we might have ever had for the business building front.
Well, look, Romeen's done it, man. That's the thing as well, to be fair. So, sorry, go on.
No,
Bilal, you had asked, Bilal, you had said, was that a realization I had had? It was not a realization I had had at the outset. It was a realization I've had by continuing to see how cash flow generative these businesses are. How do you actually operate them well, right? And if you think of them from first principles, and by having kind of a toe in both worlds, if you think of them from first principles, right? What are people? One of the questions I always try to ask, I don't pretend to have the answers like to all these questions, but at least one question I usually try to ask is, what is somebody, if somebody was on the outside, what does somebody not understand, about your space, about your world, right? That you may understand by function of just being in it and operating within it, right? And I think if you think of the parallels of how businesses are valued on the outside, or some of the advantages or some of the characteristics for why people ascribe, such high valuations, to other companies, right? I think a lot of those can actually be carried in and built in into these businesses. There's a lot of, just in the HR space, there's a lot of companies that have started these kind of like job board marketplaces, right, et cetera, and or kind of ancillary stuff like that. And they get these crazy valuations, and they even get bought at crazy prices. And I always scratch my head because I'm like, you're literally doing the same thing everybody else is doing. You're calling it ARR. It's not ARR, right? It's basically transactional revenue. And look, maybe this starts to go down now that we're like out of like ZERP land, but it never really made much sense to me, because you would see an old school business doing basically the same thing that just didn't have as much polish on how they were talking about it. Not that they were doing anything fundamentally different. Literally, they were doing the same exact thing. They just weren't as polished in how they were talking about it. And the valuations were just so, I mean, those companies were getting valued at 20 times revenue, and these businesses are getting valued at 6 times EBITDA. And you look at that and you're saying, somebody is wrong here, right? Like the spread is not 6x EBITDA to 20x revenue, right?
Yeah,
maybe
for
this
sure.
is not 20x revenue, and maybe it's more like 5x revenue, and maybe this isn't 6 times EBITDA, maybe it's more like 6 times revenue. But there is a spread here. And whenever there's that large of a spread, there is enough volatility to take a side of a trade, and somebody is going to be very right in that trade, and somebody is going to be very wrong in that trade. And that's kind of where the thought process of this idea of tech-enabled businesses as a source of alpha came up.
Love it. Farang, anything else on that one?
I didn't grasp until I heard, I scanned the document this morning, but Romeen, you have a convert. I mean, I'm not going to do it, but somebody should. I was going to say, did you, the only thing I tag on to what Bilal asked was any other, okay, maybe put this tech service enabled idea aside, just Bootstrap in general. You're always slinging me ideas. Is there anything top of mind on the Bootstrap side that, I wish somebody would just do this?
Yeah, I think, I think there's like a really, so in the same framing, I've been thinking up to your point. So bootstrapped ideas, yes, but also just like, what are ideas that AI can't disrupt?
Okay.
Right? It's like one of the things I'm like, I see on the horizon is just a lot of these businesses that look good today in 2-3 years, right? They may become really challenged, right? So like, I think a lot of these services businesses will end up having to go way more upstream, or they'll have to have like a lower fidelity offering, right? Because margins will definitely get cut, right? So one of the things I've been thinking about is, okay, well, what's a business, what's a business, what's an interesting business that AI can't disrupt? And I think people are underestimating how big community businesses can become. And so I think community businesses are any kind of passionate base of specific members. So let's take kind of like an entrepreneur organization, for example, right? Vistage, right, which is like a CEO consulting group. They have close to 50,000 members globally, right? And they charge $10,000 a year. That business is doing $500 million in revenue, right? I think at like 30 or 40% EBITDA. YPO is the same, right? YPO has like 40,000 members, right? Same thing, they're charging 10,000. EO, Entrepreneurs Organization, right? So I think somebody has an opportunity to build a really great version of like YPO or Vistage, et cetera, but for a more, modern entrepreneur. Chief tried to do this, right? And they're doing it, and they're focused specifically on women. And they've raised, like $1 billion valuation, et cetera. But again, I think those types of businesses they're hard to be venture backed, not because of the size, but because you can't have a community of like 50,000 people, right? Like by definition, the community, like it has negative network effects, right? The larger the community gets, the less valuable it actually is. So I think the sweet spot is something in the zone of like 5 to 10,000 or so. But I think if you can find a really dedicated niche, right, of an archetype of people, and charge 10 to 20 grand a year. So clearly, right, it's a heavy price point. And so it needs to be, either very, very skewed on the hobbyist scale. It needs to be very heavily skewed on the business value scale, et cetera. But I've been interested in looking at what are different types of communities that you can build with this kind of sweet spot of like 5,000 people, no more, no less, right? And you're charging anywhere from, call it 10 to 30,000, in there. And I think that kind of business over a decade can be worth $250 to $500 million, like comfortably.
Yeah.
And so I think there's a lot of different categories of communities that could be interesting. The entrepreneur one is one that comes out the head because there's two archetypes of YPO and Vistage that have become $400 or $500 million revenue businesses, right? Off of taking that kind of broadest, version of that community itself. But I think you could hyper verticalize. You can do it for D2C founders, SaaS founders, right? Legacy businesses, whatever it might be, right? And then take that same archetype and think about other communities or so. That could be really interesting bootstrap businesses. I think those are, by the way, the perfect example of businesses that most VCs would look at and be like, this is some small, cute, like meetup kind of thing on a Saturday afternoon. And over a decade's period of time, they can just be absolute behemoths.
I think, Romeen, what you just described there is a great example. Instead of just having 50,000, you could also have like clusters within that. And maybe the way you described was like a verticalized version for D2C founders only, agency founders only, etc., SaaS founders. But I think like, Sam Parr's doing it for Hampton. I think he's trying to take a few of those clusters. I don't know if you'd put that in the same bucket, but it sounds similar to me from what he's told me about it. And maybe I think the price point is probably similar as well, 5 to 10K. I don't know exactly. But yeah, I think what do you think of that approach?
That's
of
one
doing like
version
the cluster.
Yeah. I think the clusters is actually where like the real value is, because I think in these businesses, there's really there is a inverse network effect problem, right? And so I think if you, from the outset, if you select an archetype of people that are too broad, right, then you basically, I think, have to be YPO. You have to get to massive scale, right, of just 50,000 people or so. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to generate the level, I think, of impact that would be interesting in a business like this. And so it like everything comes back to the math, right? So like if you're a VC backed founder and by the time of exit you own 10% of the company versus let's say you're a bootstrap founder and you own 100% of the company, neither is right or wrong, right? But 10% versus 100% means your business needs to be 10x as large, right, to get the same cut, right?
Yeah.
So I think if you take the the YPO Vistage type route, or let's say the Hampton type route, right? I think that will be a great business and it'll be a huge business. But I think you just have to have a lot of people. And when you have a lot of people, it's a tough business to run, right? And so I would imagine that like, and I don't know any of the insights of their business, but I would imagine demand is not really their problem at all. I think the real challenge in that business is how do you continue to make sure that the experience is actually really good, right?
Yeah, and that it's worth the 10K a year or whatever.
That it's worth the 10K.
I think that the idea of the clusters makes more sense because you can specifically group people together and say you're an e-commerce D2C founder with 1 million in revenue. You're trying to get to 5 or 10. Now we're gonna put you up with people, maybe a group of 20 people or 50 people, and then you can bring in people that specifically done that before and help them actually achieve the kind of common goals. But yeah, anyway, so I do like that idea. And I just as you're saying that, I was also thinking of when we think of entrepreneurship kind of groups, we often think about like the tech people because that's kind of our world. But if you think of like dentists or like medical, like those guys are business owners as well. They have their own set of needs and problems. They're often doing multiple millions a year, but it's very different. They're not going to be necessarily learning stuff from like a SaaS founder in the same way that someone else might be. So I think that's really
exactly right.
interesting
and
idea.
That's why I think what you have to chase, and that's why I think like if you think of who is the intended user itself and why I think it's better to think about it this way is because like let's say you went after dentists, for example, right? I think your goal would be not just to be another young professional network, for dentists. I think what you would be striving for is like, this is the one zone where if you're an interesting dentist, like you are a part of this community. And that's what I think actually allows you to charge 20,000, 30,000, right, et cetera, because the value prop has to be commensurate with the price point, right? People will go buy a Louis Vuitton bag and they'll go buy a Walmart bag, right? Still has the same functional utility. Why do people buy a Louis Vuitton bag? Because they're ascribing some sort of, value to it. Brand value, recognition, vanity, right? Feeling good about yourself, whatever it is, right? It's not right or wrong. It's just, it's a fact.
Right?
They're
paying. The truth is in the fact they're paying for it.
The truth is in the fact that they're paying, right? So I actually think that, I think both models can work. I think if you're, let's say Hampton, I think you go for the YPO or the EO or Vistage kind of model. I think you have to have lots of people to get big. I think if you were the self-storage, Hampton or self-storage YPO or whatever, I think you could make a legitimate case to charge people $30,000 to $50,000 a year if you had the right archetype of self-storage founders. Now, you probably don't have that. You definitely don't have the numbers from a number of people perspective, but I'd actually argue it's probably better, right? Like if you only had 1,000 or 2,000 people, it's a way easier business to run logistically, right? And from a value prop perspective, I think the value prop you can describe or you can give to people really punches above its weight, right? So I think people are sleeping on communities. I think they can be a lot bigger than they are. It feels funny to say people are sleeping on communities because I feel like there's a contingent of Twitter that all they do is talk about communities. I don't think they're quite thinking about it the right way.
Yeah, it's a very different, like, oh, we're making a community for basketball fans on Discord or something. I think that's what a lot of people thought about in the last few years.
Like solopreneur kind of like, hey, here are my productivity tips and I'm making, 100,000 a month or 100,000 a year. Great. That's great. But I think I think this is an interesting idea because I think it speaks to a little bit of the culture war between VCs and bootstrappers, which is this idea of like a lifestyle business, right? So the trope on like if it's bootstrapped or you're not raising a bunch of money, et cetera, is your ambitions are actually not.
Yeah,
that big,
I hate that phrase.
right? And I actually think it's the inverse here, which is I think you can actually shoot really, really big, and I think you can retain a whole bunch of the value that you actually create by both picking an idea that's kind of quote unquote venture scale, but then on the other side being thoughtful on how you capitalize it.
The idea of negative network effect is fascinating. I never thought about that. That's my only comment on this because I know I dropped out again, which is an every episode thing. I don't know.
That's the tradition, Romeen.
We got. So now we add.
Have to drop off.
When my Canadian internet cuts out, we add some funny music now, like some.
You need Indian. You need Reliance Geo internet. Clearly,
I need that Ambani internet connection.
Exactly.
Trung, anything else before we wrap up? I know we've kept you here for longer than we originally said, Romeen, so we appreciate
the amount of cooking that was going on. Thank you so much, man. That was awesome.
Yeah, loved it. Guys. I'm happy to do this anytime. So hit me up, and I love jamming on these things. So hopefully it's helpful and interesting for everybody that's listening.
Oh, let's plug your newsletter. So in the trenches. So we got to get people to. If you're still here, we should plug at the beginning. That's my fault. We'll put them in the. That's right. We'll put it in the show notes too.
No issues at all. Hopefully it's helpful or interesting to people. I started actually writing on Twitter a lot because it was like internal therapy of running a business. I think running a business is it's not easy by any stretch. There's some days you feel like you're going to take over the world. There's some days you feel like you're going to go bankrupt. Some days you think about both of those in the same day, right? And every kind of emotion that oscillates in between. And so one of the things that I just started getting frustrated about online is you just read a lot of this like pithiness, right? These like very, very high level, 100,000 foot pieces of advice, et cetera. No, you don't do that. You actually don't do that. You do a really good job actually of surfacing like crazy wild stories and giving them to people in accessible ways.
All right, I think
there's too many of these just like very broad, broad kind of constructs, which I think if you actually really double click means somebody is super elevated and they just see the entire world at this amazing meta level and they've just abstracted these insights incredibly, or it's just people that haven't done it before and they don't know what they're talking about. And unfortunately, I think it's like
create a product people want. Oh, well done. Yeah, we never thought of that before, but
exactly,
you're right. Most of the time, it's just that level.
I think 99% are kind of in that latter bucket, right? And so I started doing this as kind of like selfishly doing it, but then part of the reason I like investing while operating, right, is you just meet so many interesting people. You talk through so many different businesses, you learn a lot, et cetera. And, especially as I would, invest in, to different companies and such, and then see their journeys, right? And see how these companies did well, how they didn't do well, all the difficult decisions you make all along. It turns out that I think a lot of the knowledge that you can accrue actually comes from this idea, which I firmly believe in, which is get in the trenches, right? So actually do the work, right? And learn by doing, don't learn by reading, listening, observing, et cetera. That's helpful to a degree, but nothing simulates actually being in the trenches or being in the weeds. And the reason for that is it turns out that, business is intellectually not that difficult. Sorry about that. I'll reset up. It turns out that business is not that intellectually difficult, right? Ideally, you put something out into the world and you charge people for it and money comes in. Ideally, you spend a little bit less than that money that's coming in and you make some money, right? Like intellectually, it's not that difficult. The difficult part is the emotional part of business, right? So if you haven't built a company or operated a company, you don't know what it feels like for a deal to fall apart at the last minute, for a customer to, sack you unnecessarily or yell at you or whatever it might be, for an employee to, lie, manipulate, cheat, or steal, to have to lay off someone, right? And affect their family, to, have a partner kind of abuse your trust, right? Or put their interests above yours. You can read about these things all day long. You don't actually know how it's going to feel until it happens to you, right? So anyways, this is a very, very long-winded way of saying I started writing this newsletter partly because it was own internal therapy. It seemed like a lot of people, tens of thousands of people read it today, like it, and it seems like it helps people, and that brings me a lot of happiness as well. And so if you are building a business and one guy's advice or kind of battle scars can help you through your journey, then I'm biased, but I think it's a great newsletter to subscribe to. So
where should they go to sign up, Romeen?
You just go to my Twitter. It's super simple. You can either just go to my first name, last name.com, so RomeenSheth.com, or you can go to my Twitter, and it's right there in the bio.
Or click in the show notes because we'll have it there as well. Go sign up for that. Romeen, appreciate you coming on the show, dude. Absolutely smashed it on that. Really appreciate it. We got to do it again sometime, get an update of how the business is going. A huge congrats to you building that business, man. I know how hard it is to get to that level of scale. Bootstrap especially is like most people don't ever get there. So congrats, dude.
I appreciate it, guys. This was a lot of fun.
That was awesome. Thanks, buddy.
Makes sense.